Hey everyone. Hey everyone. Cool. So, thank you all so much. We are so excited to receive your brilliant questions. Who wants to kick us off?
Thank you, Orly, for speaking. I wanted to ask you, is your understanding that post-1948 that Middle Eastern Jews, and we'll talk about Iran, which is where you're from, fled from Iran, or was it the leadership that was responsible for Jews, and not only from Iran, from Iraq and so on, to Israel, or were the Israeli forces responsible for creating an environment to some degree that made it unfavourable for Jews to remain? Could you elaborate on that, please?
Thank you.
Thank you. The Iranian Jewish community is a separate issue. We never fled. I mean, it is still until today the biggest Jewish community in the Middle East outside Israel. I mean, I still have relatives in Iran, and they are fully recognized. We have the Jewish population in Iran. They have representatives in the Iranian parliament. The Jewish school in which I studied as a kid in Tehran is still there, and my cousins' children are studying there. And when my parents immigrated in 1979, at the beginning of the revolution, they didn't do that because they fled or because they couldn't stay in Iran for any reason. They did that for the same reason that many Muslim Iranians left Iran at that point, because they understood that life is going to be very, very different under the Islamic Republic. But it certainly, and until today, it doesn't discriminate Jews in any way. It's hard, like it's hard for everybody in Iran, but with the Arab countries, it was different. We were actually just speaking about it yesterday. I'll start with the Zionist point, and then it's very funny how Zionism cannot figure out how to build the narrative around the arrival of the Jewish communities from the Arab countries. On the one hand, it really wants to say they are refugees and they fled, and of course it goes to compare the possession they left behind with the possession of the Palestinians who were displaced in 1948. So, let's just even out, you took that. But at the same time, Zionism doesn't really want to call them refugees because it wants to present them as good Zionists who came to Israel because of Zionist motivations, and not because they found refuge or they fled. It became very difficult for Jewish, certainly the events of 1948, followed by the establishment of the State of Israel, made it very, very difficult for Jewish communities to remain in the Arab countries. In some places it made it impossible. In other places it didn't. Like, again, I'm using the example of Iraq. The majority or the mainstream of the Jewish community in Iraq were, or the elite, the intellectual elite, was they were very much rooted in the Iraqi national thought, even the communist ones among them, and then to encourage, so to speak, the Jewish community to leave, the Jewish agency actually planted bombs in Jewish synagogues in Baghdad to make them afraid and to create some sort of panic that it took responsibility and admitted it only decades later, but they did admit to that. Nowadays, in the past decade or so, there's a really interesting trend among the Muslims in those Arab countries, especially in Morocco and Iraq also. Second and third generations of Muslims after 48 are looking around and starting to ask, where are the Jewish neighbors that our parents told us about? What happened to them? There are some beautiful films that were made both by one Iraqi filmmaker and one Moroccan Muslim filmmaker. But yeah, could there have been a different reality in which Jewish communities remained? It's hard to tell, but the bottom line is that the new reality that was created after 48, de facto made it impossible. So I don't know if it answers your question.
Oh, thank you. Mine is kind of more, I guess, statements, and I hope that's okay. Because following on from Crystal's mention of media, I just want to let people know there's a community radio station in Melbourne that most of you will know about, 3CR. So you can get alternative voices on there, and especially when it comes to things like treaty, and especially as it's a government-initiated process, there is a lot of questions being asked. The government wasn't interested, I think both sides of our major parties weren't interested in sovereignty. They stamped on that idea when Lydia Thorpe, as a Greens politician, in her short time, mentioned sovereignty and tried to get that recognised, or a commitment for recognition of that. Aboriginal sovereignty was poo-hooed, stomped on, no hope of that, So I find it, personally, and I know okay, white voices can be heard, but shouldn't overtake Indigenous voices, obviously. I think to be something for Indigenous people, they need to be recognising the grassroots as well as the hand-selected people they've been consulting with. And because that's what's been happening, there's been a lot of hand-selected organisations, I think, from what we're hearing, who've had, a place at the table, and grassroots people, their opinions have been really discounted. And I'm talking about strong activists, from various mobs around the country, or the state, should I say. But I just fail to see, like as was said, the Jabberah, the trees, sacred trees. How can we have a government and government organisations, big roads and what have you, talking about taking those trees down from a sacred site when they're talking about treaty? Yeah, and also, how can we have such a massive situation like Tanya Day? I could fall asleep on a train and I'm not going to be arrested and I'm not going to end up as a death in custody. I know that for a fact. So I just want people to think about that seriously when they're looking at treaties. It's the voices of, First Nations people on the ground, I think, that really need to have equal weight. So, thank you.
Did anyone want to respond to that? Yeah, I have that.
Good afternoon, everybody. I just have a quick question. I was discussing with the lady next to me here for a couple of minutes, but I have to raise the question. My question is related to the deal of the century, which most of us hear about it in the media, and which Jared Kushner and President Trump are trying to force the Palestinians to accept, to bribe them to accept, and surprisingly, he's trying to force the Arab countries to pay for that deal. Now, my question is there any wise voices in Israel who stand up and say this is unjust to deprive the Palestinians from their basic rights? Okay, and I'm asking that because I have relatives and brothers living there, and they keep telling me that they rarely see or hear anybody who stand up and say this is unjust, stop it. On the contrary, the media there is praising Netanyahu for achieving this historic deal in favor of Israel on the expense of the Palestinians. So this is my question. Is there any one voices who would stand up and say no to this stupid deal? Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
No, the sad fact is that anybody could have answered because the answer is very simple. No. And just to elaborate a little bit about that, most of this is such an advanced stage to be at as a Jewish Israeli to even understand what this deal means really and why is it unjust also Palestinians. The majority of the Jewish Israeli population is hundreds of miles before getting to that place. The majority of the Israeli Jewish population lives its life very comfortably. I mean, I'm not speaking about, of course, there's the issues of class and all the problems that any normal society faces. But vis-a-vis the Palestinians, they don't unless there are missiles from Gaza, and even then it's directed usually at the periphery in the south. So a regular Jewish guy in Tel Aviv, in central Israel, in a very prosperous city, can go his entire life without bothering himself about the question. He will go to the army, he might press Palestinians at a checkpoint. He will tell himself that he's part of the security needs of the state of Israel, and he will come back and live his entire life without knowing what's going on. And so understanding the context of the geopolitical context of this deal and why is it not, and then if they hear about it in the news, what they will hear in the Israeli news is that there are some Arab countries that are actually supportive. They will learn about the Bahrain conference, and they will say, well, fine, if the Arab world is embracing that, and then why should we oppose? So it must be, inside Israel, the Palestinian citizens are very sadly torn because of inner politics, but also because they need to face now with the Nakba law and with the new nation state law and with name it law. The list of the Palestinians in the West Bank are crushed under a very, very brutal and violent occupation. The Palestinians in Gaza are really basically just trying to survive, literally just survive. Yeah. So you don't even see a true Palestinian resistance, let alone the Jewish resistance. You don't even see in Ramallah. There were like a couple of gatherings, very small protests against this deal. And this is Ramallah, that is Area A, and is supposedly under full control of the Palestinian Authority, and Abu Mazen is actually sitting there. So you cannot even imagine something like that in Jenin or in Nablus or anywhere else in there. So you don't even have the Palestinians really resisting because of very much understandable reasons, but it's not. But the fact is that it's not there. So. And again, the Israeli public sees that mainly, the Israeli media really put a lot of emphasis, made it a point to, showing how supportive the Arab world is. And we know that Iran is against it, so if Iran against it, we must be for it. Yeah. That's how the Israeli mind works. Yeah. And so that's the long answer, but the short answer is that no, unfortunately.
Nice to meet you. I just want to add one thing to that, which is that actually the lack of Palestinian resistance is precisely what Oslo was designed to do.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Can you expand on that?
Oh, sure. So if you look at the two intifadas, so the first intifada happens in 1987, and it's really quite effective. It becomes a huge PR problem for Israel, and they do manage to get some recognition out of this. And arguably that's what leads to Oslo and and Oslo shuts it all down. And so by the time of the Second Intifada in 2002, you have a really geographically incoherent movement because of the way that areas A, B and C function. But that's also means that you can't politically organise, right? Like, you can't go to Gaza. In fact, Gaza is conceptually almost as far away for Palestinians in the West Bank as it is for Israelis. It's been produced as a space of criminality. Even at the time that Oslo was being negotiated, so like in the mid-90s, there was meant to be a road corridor down to Gaza, and you could only travel on it if you had permits. I think only about 200 were granted, and then they closed it down again. And so it's, and if you remember the Second Intifada, there was one particular event, and that was the siege of the church, the Nativity of Bethlehem, famous church, right? And there's a whole lot of Palestinian gunmen, in inverted commas. And the question is, as the siege goes on, is what are we going to do at the end of this? We're not going to shoot the church. It's just the world's watching us because this is a significant place, so what are we going to do with these people? They negotiate or broker for some people to go to Europe. Italy says they'll have some people, other European countries say they'll have some people, but the worst people go to Gaza because that is what Gaza is, it's a prison, right?
Orly, I know you said you hardly represent a sample of the Israeli society, but can you tell us a little bit about the history of the Black Panther in Israel? I know that they were not active for a long time, and their activism and their was supported almost immediately by the Israeli government, but there was some solidarity with Palestinian people that was built. And what is that kind of stance? In what shape does it exist now? And the Ethiopian community experiences discrimination and racism as well, and they're rioting in the streets as well. I'm not seeing any connection between the Ethiopians and the Palestinians as it did with the Black Panther Party, but you can give us maybe a little bit about that.
Thank you for that question. The Black Panthers, the Israeli Black Panthers, is probably the first really organized, politically aware Mizrahi resistance group. And it was, it's not the first, the first really Mizrahi uprising, by the way, was in 1958 in Wadi Salib in Haifa. And I'm mentioning Wadi Salib as well because just like with the Black Panthers, who were a bunch of very simple street guys, Mizrahi street guys from the most underprivileged neighborhood of Jerusalem, just, very intuitively almost said, well, they are screwing us over because we are Mizrahi and there is no other explanation for that. And they started just doing some direct actions, like, back in those days they used to, the milkman would put the milk in front of, so they just collected very elegantly the milk from the rich neighborhoods, the white rich neighborhoods, and they brought it, and then they outrooted the flowers that this municipality would plant in those neighborhoods and said, well, if you don't, we will do it ourselves. And they brought it to their neighborhoods and planted, and that. But they started political awareness, and they very quickly started beautifully eloquating themselves and articulating themselves in political terms. Now, what you're pointing is, I think it was that, again, everything about the Mizrahi experience today is some form of tragedy. And one of the tragedies is that years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, the Mizrahim, when the political awareness started, it immediately and intuitively came with solidarity with the Palestinians. And I'm talking about the Israeli Palestinian citizens. So I mentioned Wadi Salim in the 50s, when Mizrahis were still really, treated as barbarians, more or less, by the establishment, and for them to even, thinking about organizing themselves in a political frame, it was already something almost inconceivable. And even then, when they published a list of demand, which they just sat and wrote down with very poor Hebrew at the time. One of the first articles on that list of demands is to finish the military regime over the Palestinian citizens, because way before the occupation, today we tend to think, or people like to present it as if all of Israel's racism and problems began with the occupation of 67. No, way before the occupation of 67, the Palestinian citizens of Israel were under military regime. And the Mizrahis were the first Jewish, voice to say, hey, that's wrong. I mean, they're screwing us like they're screwing them, and the connections were very, very immediate. And the Black Panthers in the late 60s, again, very naturally cooperated with Palestinians and with Matzpen, which was just, a Palestinian Jewish radical left organization. And what put an end to the Black Panthers as such was more than anything the War of 1973, the Yom Kippur War, because like often happens in Israel, when there is a war, and there is always a war, Israelis are expected to stand in line and to become like more patriotic, and then nobody is willing, and in a very violent way, to listen to any other voice or narrative. So most of the bigger part of the reason why the Black Panthers really ceased to exist as such was the 73 war. Some of them continued, like Ruben Abergil, who was until today is one of the most amazing, inspiring, courageous political activists, and he still does that. Others went into politics. Charlie Beaton, who was in many ways the face of the Black Panthers. Here is another aspect of the Mizrahi tragedy. He became a Knesset member on the votes of Palestinians because he ran in the as part of the Communist Party, which more than 80 to 85% of its voters come from the Palestinian society. So he entered the Knesset, the parliament, on the voices of Palestinians, and then he took a shift and became very problematic and very racist with his politics against Palestinians. And this is a shift that you can see because again, the incorporating the Mizrahis into the Zionist project was done in a very sophisticated way. And they were given, speaking of class, by the way, they were given a chance that they never had before to upgrade their socio-economic situation in the settlements, because it was cheap land and very much, encouraged by the. So throughout the years, the conflict that the state manipulatively created between the interest of the Mizrahis and the interest of the Palestinians grew those two communities more and more apart. But the tragedy is that the more further you go back in history, the closer these two communities work together. And so now today we are really, just a bunch of us. I'm saying that sadly, really sadly, that there is a bunch of us, of Mizrahi political activists who root their activism in their Mizrahi identity and come to the solidarity with Palestinians from that perspective.
Yeah, we've just got time for one more question. Sorry.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been amazing. My name is Melanie, and I have been, I think about the stuff like 24/7, but I'm very interested in that idea of about reading history, reading what the acts and technologies that are going on right now, because as you said, it happens in stages. So a lot of where I focus, I suppose my attention is, hey, this is what's happening in literacy, racial, colonial literacy. And I was really interested in what you were saying about where we, as I'm a migrant settler of colour, and where we're located. And I'm thinking about, in colonial India, they paid Indian women, they created the race. So there is another position which is more than just the minority. There is the privileged new race minority. That is also a really important strategy. So that they paid Indian women to have created the Anglo-Indian race, and then they were given an elevated position. So they weren't the majority, so they could never fight the majority, but they were given special, and this has happened in so many colonial sites. And I'm just thinking, the women, I'm offended by feminists, but the breeding of that takes time. You said 70 years, and it really clicked with me. The multicultural, are that group that we've been brought in to stymie and to feel like, okay, it doesn't belong to us, but the breeding of that new set, that's why they never want us here, really. They only want us to subjects of capital. Maybe they just want us to consume, create people so that they can make money, but also to have babies, so that we are breeding that sort of, and I'm just thinking, I was just having a chat today about, we call them millennials or whatever, but there is a kind of a deadness that sort of when you grow up and you get educated, it takes time to remove the energy and remove the intelligence that you've got. So I was just thinking, like, in terms of the movable middle, we are probably, and we should pick the most movable of that movable middle and work there, because I'm like Fatima, I just try and do, my Sri Lankan community, I do it like, critical race stuff with them, they just think, oh yeah, let it go. But they laugh about it afterwards, and I, only find out later, I'm thinking, what a waste of time. So anyway, that's a bit of a rant, but it's very, very interesting, and I think the location, what I find most annoying, all of us oppressed or different, others and others, we locate ourselves, but middle-class white women in feminism do not locate themselves. They insert themselves in that space to mediate the power. So basically, I just think if we could strategize a bit more and really pick where we're going to push and work with the movable middle, there could be a bit more, like for example, why can't we have a BDS in Australia? Serco, I work around the corner, they mow this lawn. They offered that NAIDOC, do you know that NAIDOC? They do, yeah. So they actually mow this lawn. They do garden services, they do all kinds of business. So why can't we have a BDS here, for example?
That video that the feed done on the Serco about 5 years ago is fucked.
Oh my God.
Where they are, like they control time.
They do control time, and all over the world it's transnational. I'm thinking of Aileen Morton Robinson, it's transnational because I did my stuff with asylum centres in Ireland. They change their name, it's the same people, it's the same money. And like the class-based, I don't know, but I do think we need to strategize because they're killing us, they're making us smaller and smaller and smaller like Gaza till we will never know each other again. So I think solidarity is about how do we keep that, and we're at the fringes of that. Anyway, shut up, Melanie. I had a coffee today, I apologise. Sorry, and I love you. It's so wonderful to be here and listen to it together. Yeah. Sorry, I had a coffee. I don't know if there was a question, but please
excuse
my rant.
It was a perfect way to bring this to a close. I mean, this is exactly what we want to get at, and this is exactly the kind of space that AJDS wants to be thinking in, is how can we all come together to resist and to build solidarities, and that's what this afternoon was about, precisely, and why we wanted to have these four wonderful, just totally inspiring, genius thinkers and actors together. And how can we produce more of these spaces of us all being together and doing tangible work and reading and learning. And that's exactly what we want to do. So always come up to us if you think of ways that we can do this work together. So thank you. On that note, we will wrap up. I'm trying to figure out the best way to say the next few things I'm going to say. What I'm going to say is, first off, how great was Orly? And if you would like to hear her, some more of her, welcome her. Orly is here for a week, less than a week now, and there's 2 more events in Melbourne where you can come and hear her speak, and we would love to see you there, and we would love you to spread the word that what Orly has to say is a message that we don't often hear in Melbourne, and it's just so crucial that we think it's crucial that we build these solidarities by hearing more of these and having more of these conversations. So on Monday night, you can taste some delicious Moroccan soup bar food, and you can hear Orly in conversation with Noura Mansour, and that's at 7:30 p.m. at Moroccan Soup Bar to go. There's not many spots available. Tickets, I think there's only a handful of tickets left. So we really encourage you to go home and book a ticket and come on to that. I'm obviously going to say that at the end. And the other event that you can come to is on Wednesday night at 6:30 p.m. at the State Library. Orly will be speaking about an Iranian-Israeli response to Zionism. So that's 6:30 on Wednesday night, and all the information and tickets for both of those events, as well as, so Orly will be going from here to Sydney, so if you've got friends in Sydney, let them know. Orly is going to be doing a series of events in Sydney next week, so not next week, the week after. So you can find them all on our website, which is ajds.org.au, or you can find us by Googling the Australian Jewish Democratic Society. I want to remind you all to sign the petition at the back, to download a copy of the petition, to send it in the next couple of weeks. It's a petition for 10-year day. And I want to end by thanking our wonderful, wonderful panellists and giving them a gift from AJDS, and just for joining me in thanking them.
And if anyone wants to go on the mailing list of the AJDS, before you leave, just add an email address up the front, and we encourage you to join us as well.